Think the Saw movies were gruesome? The Mesopotamians would laugh. Their justice system handed out punishments that made medieval torture look quaint. And if you thought gladiators were the height of brutal entertainment, wait till you hear about the Aztecs' version of game night. The Aztecs, a society built on blood. The Aztecs didn't just practice human sacrifice, they ran it like an industry. It wasn't a rare ritual, it was a daily event. If you lived in Tenochtitlan, you either watched sacrifices or became one. The empire believed the gods needed fresh human hearts to keep the sun rising. No sacrifices, no sunlight. Simple as that. The numbers are staggering. When Templo Mayor was rededicated in 1487, records claim 80,000 people were sacrificed in just 4 days. Some historians say this was an exaggeration, but even conservative estimates put the annual death toll at 20,000. That's an assembly line level of killing. The victims weren't buried quietly either. Their skulls were put on tsompantli, massive racks displaying thousands of heads. The biggest one held over 100,000 skulls, a reminder of what happened to enemies of the empire. Most sacrifices came from war. The Aztecs didn't fight to kill on the battlefield, they fought to capture. Prisoners weren't just trophies, they were currency for the gods. The more captives a warrior brought back, the higher their status. A soldier who killed in battle was seen as careless. A soldier who captured dozens alive? That was a hero. Sacrifices were not quick or painless. Victims were marched up steep temple steps where 4 priests held them down on a stone slab. The executioner, using a razor-sharp obsidian knife, sliced open the chest and tore out the still-beating heart. The heart was lifted to the sky, while the body was thrown down the temple steps. But the ritual didn't end there. Some bodies were skinned, and their flesh was worn by priests. Others were dismembered, their bones used as relics. Not all sacrifices were warriors. Children were prime offerings, especially to Tlaloc, the rain god. The Aztecs believed children's tears brought rain, so priests ensured they cried before death. Some were drowned, others were burned alive. If a child had physical deformities, they were considered even more sacred and were more likely to be sacrificed. Some victims didn't go to waste, at least not by Aztec standards. There was cannibalism. The elite feasted on the arms and thighs of sacrificed warriors. It wasn't for survival, it was a ceremonial meal. Eating the flesh of a fallen enemy was believed to transfer their power. But only the high-ranking elite got to eat. If you were a commoner, you had to settle for maize. The sacrifices weren't just about religion, they were political control. The Aztecs ruled over dozens of subject states, and these regions were forced to send people for sacrifice. Imagine being ruled by an empire that demanded your family members as a blood tax. No surprise that many of these states hated the Aztecs. So when Hernán Cortés and his Spanish forces arrived in 1519, they didn't have to fight the Aztecs alone. The people the empire had terrorized for years were more than happy to help take them down. Cortés formed alliances with these states, using their knowledge and manpower to launch an assault on the Aztec capital. By 1521, after brutal battles and a devastating smallpox epidemic, Tenochtitlan fell. When the Spanish stormed the city, they were horrified by what they found. Towering skull racks, blood-stained temples, and human sacrifices still happening as the city burned. Cortés and his men may not have been saints, but even they put an end to the Aztecs' ritual slaughter. And just like that, an empire built on blood collapsed in a sea of fire, disease, and betrayal. The gods didn't save them. Maybe they were full. The Spartans, a nightmare of social engineering. The moment a Spartan baby took its first breath, it was judged. If the child was weak, sickly, or had any kind of deformity, it was abandoned in the wilderness or tossed off a cliff at Mount Taygetus. No exceptions. Sparta didn't waste resources on the unfit. Only the strongest survived, and even they weren't safe for long. Sparta wasn't a city of art, culture, or philosophy. It was a military factory. Every male citizen existed for one purpose: war. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and thrown into the agage, a state-run training program that made modern boot camps look like daycare. Their education? Learning how to fight, steal, and endure pain without complaint. Literacy was an afterthought. Spartan boys weren't trained to be thinkers. They were trained to be killers. Starvation was part of the program. Boys were encouraged to steal food but beaten mercilessly if they were caught, not because they stole, but because they failed to do it properly. They were also routinely whipped, sometimes to death, in public endurance trials. The message was clear: pain was a lesson and weakness was a death sentence. The violence wasn't just training, it was entertainment. Spartan boys were forced to fight each other, often to the brink of death. The weak were culled early, and only the strongest made it to adulthood. By the time a Spartan reached 20, he was a full-fledged soldier, expected to fight until either victory or death. Even then, he wasn't free. Spartans lived in military barracks until age 30, only seeing their families in secret. Marriage was allowed, but husbands often had to sneak out at night just to be with their wives. Love wasn't a priority, producing the next generation of warriors was. Then there were the helots, the enslaved underclass who made up the majority of Sparta's population. Sparta had no economy, no industry, and no trade. Instead, helots did all the farming, labor, and domestic work. The catch? They were treated like livestock. The Spartan government saw them as a permanent threat because, logically, if your slaves outnumber you 10-1, they're probably not thrilled about it. So how did Sparta maintain control? Terror. Every year, the Spartans declared ritual war on the helots. Young Spartan warriors, called cryptia, were sent out into the countryside to assassinate helots at random. No weapons, no armor, just a dagger and the element of surprise. This wasn't a rebellion crackdown. The helots didn't have to do anything wrong. Killing them was simply a rite of passage for young warriors. The goal was to keep them afraid, hopeless, and too terrified to rise up. Sparta was the only Greek city-state where murder was state-sanctioned genocide. Spartan women lived under a different but equally extreme set of rules. Compared to other Greek women, they had more rights, but that's only because they were expected to breed soldiers. They were trained from childhood to be physically strong, racing, wrestling, and exercising to ensure they could produce healthy sons. If a woman couldn't bear children, she was considered useless. Spartan wives were even expected to share their husbands if another woman needed a child. Love? Personal choice? Not important. The only thing that mattered was making more Spartans. Despite their terrifying reputation, Spartans weren't invincible. Their rigid system made them terrible at adapting. They refused to embrace change, trade, or diplomacy. That worked until they met an enemy they couldn't overpower. In 371 BCE, the Spartans suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Leuctra against Thebes. This was the first time their unbeatable army was exposed as just another military force. The Thebans used innovative tactics, flanking and outmaneuvering the rigid Spartan formations. The result? Sparta's army was shattered, and their myth of invincibility died on the battlefield. The fall of Sparta wasn't sudden. It was a slow, painful collapse. Over the next century, they lost influence, territory, and soldiers. Unlike Athens, which rebuilt itself after defeat, Sparta had nothing to fall back on. No economy, no culture, no innovation, just war. And when they could no longer dominate their enemies, they became irrelevant. By the time Rome took over Greece, Sparta was a living museum, a once feared empire reduced to a novelty for foreign tourists. The Spartans thought they were building the ultimate warrior society. What they actually built was a ticking time bomb. The same system that made them strong also made them fragile, and when it finally collapsed, no one rushed to save them. Mesopotamia, justice in the age of cruelty. If you ever find yourself complaining about modern laws, just be glad you weren't living in ancient Mesopotamia.
Hello.
This was a society where breaking a rule didn't just get you fined, it got you mutilated, drowned, or executed on the spot. Justice wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about making an example out of people in the most brutal way possible. And if you thought punishments were reserved for serious crimes, think again. In Mesopotamia, simply building a faulty house could cost you your life. The most infamous legal system of the time was Hammurabi's Code, written in 1755 BCE. This wasn't just a set of laws, it was a blueprint for state-sponsored violence. With over 280 laws, it covered everything from property disputes to murder, and its signature punishment was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, literally. If you broke someone's arm, the government would break yours. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son was executed. Justice wasn't about fairness, it was about revenge, served cold, public, and with extreme prejudice. Then there were the punishments reserved for the lower classes. Wealthy nobles could sometimes pay a fine and walk away, but if you were poor, your options were limited to death, dismemberment, or slavery. They were at the very bottom, treated as property. If they talked back, they could have their ears cut off. If they tried to escape, their master could gouge out their eyes. And if a woman was accused of adultery, straight to the Euphrates River for a trial by drowning. If she survived, she was innocent. If she drowned, well, case closed. Criminals weren't the only ones who suffered. Doctors had their own high-risk profession, and malpractice wasn't taken lightly. If a surgeon botched an operation on a noble and the patient died, the surgeon's hands were cut off. There were no second chances. If you were a Mesopotamian doctor, you either got it right the first time or you never worked again. Literally. And don't think priests had it easy either. Mesopotamians took their gods seriously. If a priest misinterpreted an omen or a fortune teller made a bad prediction, they could be beaten, exiled, or killed for misleading the people. Religion and law were deeply connected, and disobeying the gods was seen as worse than disobeying the king. Execution methods were creative and public. Hanging, impalement, burning alive. Mesopotamians didn't just kill criminals, they made a show out of it. Some criminals were skinned alive, while others were buried in the walls of buildings as human sacrifices to ensure a structure's strength. If you were really unlucky, you might be sentenced to the pit of lions, where death wasn't instant, but a slow, bloody spectacle. But here's the irony. For all their brutality, Mesopotamians were also pioneers of civilization. They gave the world writing, irrigation, and organized government. But they also made sure breaking the rules meant you suffered in ways that would make medieval torture look mild. Their laws kept order, but they did it through fear. Over time, newer civilizations phased out Mesopotamian justice. The Persians, the Greeks, and later the Romans introduced less extreme, but still brutal, legal systems. But Hammurabi's code remained one of the most influential legal documents in history. Even today, the concept of an eye for an eye still lingers, just without the part where people get their actual eyes ripped out. Mesopotamians built the foundation of modern society, but they also proved that civilization and state-sanctioned cruelty can go hand in hand. And for thousands of years, nobody really questioned it. Ancient Egypt, the dark side of divine perfection. Ancient Egypt is remembered for pyramids, golden tombs, and powerful pharaohs. But what's usually left out? The fact that Egyptian elites were obsessed with the human body, and not in a way that makes anyone comfortable. They weren't just building monuments to honor the dead. They were cutting people open, experimenting on corpses, and possibly even manipulating genetics in ways that would raise a few eyebrows today. Egyptians believed the body was sacred, but to them, sacred didn't mean untouchable. It meant worth modifying, preserving, and sometimes outright dissecting. Their priests and embalmers were early surgeons, performing medical procedures that would have been considered nightmares anywhere else. They conducted brain removal through the nose, internal organ extraction, and experimental surgeries, some of which appear to have been tested on the living first. Egyptian medical texts describe procedures that sound more like a horror script than early science. Doctors performed primitive brain surgery, drilling holes into skulls to relieve pressure, though the survival rate was questionable. Some treatments involved burning wounds with fire, pouring hot resin into cuts, or applying mixtures of crocodile dung and honey to injuries. The idea was that the gods guided medicine, and apparently, the gods had a twisted sense of humor. But it wasn't just medicine, it was experimentation. Evidence suggests that prisoners, slaves, and the poor were used as medical test subjects. These weren't quick or painless procedures. Victims were often cut open while still alive, so priests could observe the effects of disease in real time. If a person had a mystery illness, their body became a science experiment. No consent, no anesthesia. Just brutal curiosity. Then there's the royal gene pool, which was more of a genetic disaster than a divine bloodline. Pharaohs married their own sisters, daughters, and nieces, all to keep their lineage pure. The result? Generations of rulers with severe birth defects, mental impairments, and genetic disorders. King Tutankhamun was a medical wreck. He had a clubfoot, malformed bones, and a severe overbite, all thanks to his parents being siblings. His family wasn't unique. Many pharaohs suffered from diseases caused by inbreeding, but the idea of marrying outside the royal family was unthinkable. And then there's mummification, the real horror show. Egyptians believed that preserving the body was essential for the afterlife, which meant removing anything they deemed unnecessary, like the brain. The process involved stabbing a hooked instrument through the nose, scrambling the brain into mush, and then yanking it out in pieces. The heart, however, was left intact, because Egyptians believed it was the center of intelligence. Let's be honest, not their best scientific guess. Organs were carefully removed, dried, and stored in canopic jars, while the rest of the body was soaked in natron salt for 40 days to remove moisture. The elite were lavishly preserved, while the lower classes, not so much. Many commoners were buried in mass graves, left to rot in the desert. But even elite mummies weren't safe. If you thought being buried in a gold-covered tomb protected you, think again. Tomb raiding wasn't just a crime, it was an economy. Many mummies were looted, burned, or even ground into powder and sold as medicine. Yes, Europeans in the Middle Ages believed crushed mummy remains could cure disease. Thousands of Egyptian mummies were turned into miracle powders and consumed, because apparently there's no limit to bad medical advice. And then there's the accidental mummies, not the kind prepared for the afterlife, but the ones preserved by pure chance. Egyptian tombs created the perfect dry, airtight conditions, which meant that some people who weren't even meant to be mummified ended up naturally preserved for centuries. Archaeologists have found bodies that still have hair, skin, and even tattoos, as if they just fell asleep 3,000 years ago. The Egyptian obsession with the afterlife went beyond mummies. Some pharaohs were buried with their servants, because why not bring your workforce to the afterlife? While other cultures practiced human sacrifice, Egyptians had their own spin. Kill a few people so they can serve the king forever. High-ranking officials, servants, and even animals were strangled or buried alive, all so their ruler wouldn't have to lift a finger in the next world. Egyptians were obsessed with preserving bodies for eternity, but the reality? Most of those bodies ended up stolen, destroyed, or eaten. For a civilization fixated on immortality, they sure did a lot of horrifying things to the living. The Incas, death as a sacred duty. The Inca Empire wasn't just a society, it was a well-oiled machine fueled by devotion, sacrifice, and a whole lot of terror. While they're often remembered for engineering marvels and vast cities, one thing history books don't emphasize enough is how they kept their gods happy. The Incas didn't just accept death, they embraced it. And if you were chosen for sacrifice, there was no escape. Unlike other civilizations that sacrificed prisoners of war, the Incas preferred their victims to be perfect, the best offerings, children. They believed kids were the purest beings, making them the ultimate tribute to the gods. This wasn't a last-minute execution. These children were selected months, sometimes years in advance, fed the best foods, and treated like royalty. But they weren't being rewarded. They were being prepared to die. The most infamous ritual was Capacocha, a state-run sacrifice system designed to ensure the empire's relationship with the gods stayed strong. When an emperor died, when a natural disaster struck, or when a new ruler needed divine approval, the Incas turned to children. These kids, often between 6 and 15 years old, were taken from their families and sent on a grueling march through the Andes. Some walked hundreds of miles to reach their final resting place, dressed in elaborate clothes and adorned with jewelry, because even in death, appearances mattered. Execution methods varied. Some were drugged with coca leaves and chicha, fermented corn beer, left to freeze high in the mountains where they would die of hypothermia. Others were strangled, suffocated, or hit over the head with a blunt object to ensure a swift death. The cold, dry climate preserved their bodies perfectly. When archaeologists uncovered them centuries later, some were so intact that they still had blood in their veins. Scans even revealed something horrifying. Some children woke up moments before dying, meaning they were aware, at least briefly, of what was happening. And it wasn't just children. Wives of dead rulers were often forced to die alongside them, because apparently the afterlife required companions. In some cases, entire groups of servants, concubines, and even officials were strangled or buried alive to accompany their leaders into the next world. If you were an elite in Inca society, you weren't just living for yourself, you were living for the emperor. And when he died, you died too. Then there was ritual cannibalism. While the Incas weren't known for large-scale human consumption like some civilizations, there is evidence that certain tribes under Inca rule practiced eating human flesh. This wasn't for survival, it was a spiritual act. Consuming part of a sacrificed warrior or priest was believed to transfer their power to the living. But sacrifices weren't just about killing, they were about control. The Incas ruled over a massive empire, stretching from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, and not everyone was thrilled to be under their control. Some subject tribes were forced to offer up their own people for sacrifice, a constant reminder of who was really in charge. If a tribe resisted, they didn't just lose a few warriors in battle, they lost their children to the priests. It was psychological warfare with a spiritual twist. Despite their brutal practices, the Incas weren't bloodthirsty for no reason. Their entire empire was built on reciprocity with the gods. They believed every sacrifice, human or animal, kept nature in balance. And honestly, their empire thrived for centuries under this system. Roads, agriculture, architecture, all flourished. But when the Spanish arrived in 1532, that balance shattered. The Incas faced not just an enemy, but an unstoppable force of disease, war, and betrayal. Their civilization, once built on divine order, collapsed within a few decades. Inca sacrifice was never seen as barbaric within their own society. It was an honor, a duty, a sacred exchange. But for those chosen, it was a slow walk toward death with no way out. Their world ran on blood and devotion, until both ran out. The Scythians, nomads who dressed in human skin. If you were alive around 700 BCE, and you saw a horse archer riding fast across the grasslands, there's a good chance you were about to die. These weren't just warriors. They were Scythians, nomadic, brutal, and disturbingly creative when it came to decorating with body parts. Heads, scalps, skin, bones, nothing went to waste. The Greeks were terrified of them. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, said the Scythians drank the blood of the first man they killed in battle. Not a metaphor. First kill, bottoms up. And that was just the start of the welcome party. They lived in what's now Ukraine, southern Russia, and parts of Kazakhstan. No cities, no walls. Just thousands of armored riders who could shoot an arrow while doing backflips on a horse. The Scythians didn't believe in defense. Their strategy was simple. Strike first, kill fast, and take everything that wasn't nailed down. Captives weren't just taken, they were processed. Scythians were known for scalping their enemies and turning the skins into souvenirs. They would stretch out the scalps, tan them like leather, and hang them from their horse bridles. If you saw a guy riding past with 10 bloody flaps swinging from his saddle, that wasn't decoration. That was his kill count. But some wanted more. Elite warriors went full Hannibal Lecter. They turned human skin into cloaks, belts, and even quivers to hold their arrows. The biceps made great leather straps. The thighs, premium patchwork for armor. It wasn't survival, it was a fashion statement. Wearing your enemy was a mark of honor. You didn't just beat them, you wore them. They also loved collecting skulls. And not just any skulls. The skulls of the people they personally killed. Once you had a good one, you'd scrape off the flesh, sand down the bone, and turn it into a drinking cup. Sometimes they coated it in gold. Imagine throwing a dinner party where your wine glasses were actual heads. That was Tuesday for a Scythian chieftain. Funerals were no less insane. When a king died, dozens of people had to die with him. Wives, servants, horses, even royal chefs. They were all strangled or stabbed and buried in a giant tomb mound called a kurgan. Archaeologists have found them with gold, weapons, and skeletons arranged neatly around the king like morbid furniture. One burial in Altai held a noblewoman with tattooed skin, silk clothes, and her 2 horses, because who wants to walk in the afterlife? Their drug habits? Also wild. Herodotus claims Scythians got high by throwing hemp seeds on hot stones inside tents, then sitting in the smoke and shouting for joy. Scientists thought that was a joke, until they found scorched hemp seeds and bronze braziers in a 2,400-year-old tomb in Siberia. Turns out they were running ancient hotbox saunas in the middle of nowhere. Because after flaying your enemies, sometimes you just need to chill. But Scythian violence wasn't random. It was part of their culture. Young warriors didn't become men until they killed someone in battle. No kill, no rank. Some tribes even refused to let you eat at the adult table unless you brought a human scalp as proof. And if you were wondering how they remembered their victories, don't worry. Some kept notebooks made from strips of human skin. The thing is, Scythians were surprisingly organized. They had women warriors, complex trade routes, and horse-mounted archers that could outmaneuver nearly any army. They fought the Persians under Darius I around 513 BCE. The Persian king brought a massive force into Scythian land. The Scythians? They didn't fight directly. They just kept riding in circles, burning their own land, and cutting off supplies. After weeks of this, Darius turned back. He came with a full army and left with sunburn and humiliation. So what finally ended them? Time. Empires rose, borders hardened, and other horse tribes took over. By the 3rd century CE, the Scythians faded into history, but they didn't go quietly. Their legacy lived on in fear and body parts. The Hittites, bureaucrats of misery. If ancient empires were high school cliques, the Hittites were the cold, quiet ones who knew how to make people disappear. They didn't yell, they didn't brag. They just wrote everything down and killed you with stunning efficiency. You stole a goat? There's a rule for that. You insulted a noble? There's a punishment. You tried to rebel? There's a crater where your city used to be. The Hittite Empire ruled much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, starting around 1600s BCE. Their capital, Hattusa, looked peaceful enough. Stone walls, royal archives, lots of sheep. But behind the clay tablets and temple bells was a war machine that could torch your town and send your kids to the mines. Let's start with their legal system. The Hittites had a thing for punishment. If you committed adultery, you could be burned alive or mutilated. Depends on your social class. Stole from a temple? Death. Lied in court? Cut off your nose. Their laws stretched over 200 clay tablets, each one cataloging crimes, fines, and the best way to wreck your day. They weren't big on second chances. They were big on making examples. But laws were just the warm-up. Their army was the real nightmare. The Hittites built chariots with 3 men, one to drive, one to shield, one to kill. These weren't joyrides. These were thundering death carts. When they sacked cities, they didn't just take loot, they took people, thousands of them. Prisoners of war were forced into labor camps, digging in copper mines until their lungs gave out. If you were lucky, you got assigned to a temple to chop wood. If you weren't, you were building roads until you collapsed from heat stroke. They fought the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. That was one of the largest chariot battles in history. Ramses II, the Egyptian pharaoh, claimed he won. The Hittites also claimed they won. In reality, it was a draw, but the Hittites walked away with the upper hand. Egypt signed a peace treaty, the first known international treaty in history, because even the pharaoh didn't want a round 2. The Hittites were also really into public torture. When a city rebelled, their kings made it personal. Suppress the rebellion? Sure. But not before dragging the city's rulers in chains, executing the leaders in front of everyone, and enslaving the rest. Hittite records bragged about stacking heads at city gates. One king said he left the corpses to rot in the sun so their stench would spread fear. Charming. Religious sacrifice? Also terrifying. They believed their gods needed constant attention, and sometimes that meant blood. Animal sacrifices were common, but when things got bad, plague, drought, invasion, they turned to people. They'd bury victims alive or burn them to purify the land. Some rituals involved killing an animal and rubbing its blood on a sick person. If the sickness didn't go away, the person was blamed for offending the gods. Execution followed, problem solved. The Hittites didn't spare their own, either. If you worked in the palace and screwed up, they didn't fire you, they cursed your entire family. One scribe got caught altering a religious text. His punishment? Death by stoning, and his house burned to the ground. They didn't just erase your name, they erased your bloodline. But it wasn't all killing and curses. Sometimes they liked to get creative. One king wrote about crushing a city, then making the survivors carry its stones across the mountains to build him a new palace. That's right, you survived the invasion, and your reward is becoming human scaffolding. Build the king's house, or die tired. By the time of King Suppiluliuma, I try saying that 5 times fast, the Hittites were controlling trade routes from the Mediterranean to Babylon, and they didn't negotiate, they threatened. If a neighbor resisted tribute, Hittite messengers delivered 2 options: gifts or fire. Most cities went with gifts. But even bureaucratic monsters have weaknesses. Around 1200s BCE, the Hittite Empire collapsed during the Bronze Age catastrophe, a massive regional breakdown involving famine, climate change, and invading sea peoples who no one can fully identify. Hattusa was abandoned, burned, and left in ruins. Nobody bothered to rebuild it. That's how scared everyone was of sticking around. For centuries, the Hittites were forgotten. Their language was lost. Their history buried under ash and stone. It wasn't until 1906 that archaeologists uncovered Hattusa and found 10000 clay tablets detailing how terrifyingly organized these people really were. The Hittites didn't yell, they just wrote your name down, and then they crushed you. The Celts, where heads were currency. When Rome first marched into Gaul, they didn't find uncivilized farmers. They found people who thought cutting off heads was just part of a normal Tuesday. The Celts, who once ruled across modern France, Britain, Ireland, and parts of Central Europe, were smart, spiritual, and deeply into skulls. Like, really into skulls. These weren't fringe warriors. By 400 BCE, Celtic tribes stretched from Spain to Turkey. They built fortified towns, traded with Greece, minted coins, and knew how to use a sword. But diplomacy wasn't really their thing. If you made them angry, they'd sack your city, chop off your head, and nail it to a wall. And they'd do it all, shirtless, painted blue, and screaming like banshees. According to Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus and Roman generals like Julius Caesar, Celts would collect the heads of enemies they killed and hang them from their horses, belts, or doorways. These were trophies. You didn't just win a fight, you brought back a face to prove it. Some chieftains even embalmed heads in cedar oil and kept them as dinner decorations. The more heads you had, the more badass you were. Skull walls weren't horror movie props, they were status symbols. Then there were the Druids. Forget the wise, bearded nature lovers you've seen in cartoons. Real Druids were judges, priests, astronomers, and ritual killers. Roman sources, especially Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, accused Druids of overseeing human sacrifices to please gods like Teutates and Tyrannus. The most disturbing method? The Wicker Man. Yes, the giant, human-shaped effigy was real. According to Caesar, Druids stuffed it full of live victims, sometimes criminals, sometimes just unlucky, and set it on fire as a public ritual. Was Caesar exaggerating? Maybe. But archaeological finds back up some of it. At Lindo Moss in England, a body now known as the Lindo Man was discovered in a bog with 3 separate causes of death: strangled, bashed in the head, and throat slit. All signs point to a ritual killing. That's some serious overkill, even by ancient standards. When warriors weren't decapitating enemies, they were fighting each other for glory. Tribal rivalries meant constant skirmishes. Young warriors had to prove themselves in battle. Win a duel? Great. You might get a spot at the feasting table. Lose? Your head might be passed around as a drinking bowl. Celtic society was basically one long audition for who could die the loudest. Celtic women were just as fierce. Unlike Greek or Roman women, Celtic ladies could own land, lead troops, and even fight in battle. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, famously led a revolt against Rome in 60 CE. She burned 3 Roman cities to the ground, including London, and killed thousands of soldiers and civilians. The Romans eventually crushed her army, but they never forgot the woman who nearly drove them out of Britain. And if you thought being captured was a way to survive, don't. Prisoners were paraded, mocked, and sacrificed. In some cases, they were stabbed in the ribs and thrown into pits. The Celts didn't believe in killing cleanly. Pain was part of the ritual. It was a spiritual transaction. The more dramatic the death, the more impressive the offering. Still, none of that stopped Rome. By the 1st century CE, the Romans had pushed deep into Celtic territory. They outlawed Druidism, banned human sacrifice, and began dismantling tribal structures. Temples were replaced with Roman baths. The skulls came down. The heads, buried or forgotten. But even after Rome crushed the Celtic tribes, the legends survived. Stories of cursed groves, burning giants, and talking skulls stuck around in folklore for centuries. And modern archaeology keeps confirming one uncomfortable truth. The Celts weren't just myths, they really were that wild. And if a druid told you your blood could fix the weather, guess what? You didn't get a vote. The Assyrians. Terror was their whole personality. If there was an award for most violent empire in antiquity, the Assyrians would take it, melt it down, and use the metal to brand their enemies. These weren't just conquerors. They were professional tormentors. From around 900 to 600 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire turned mass killings into policy, and their idea of diplomacy was leveling your city and writing about it in stone. Let's get the timeline straight. The Assyrians started as a small kingdom in northern Mesopotamia. By the 9th century BCE, they were steamrolling their neighbors. Under kings like Ashur-Nisirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III, they built an empire stretching from modern Iraq to Egypt. How? With spears, siege engines, and a full-blown addiction to cruelty. Ashur-Nisirpal II once bragged about stacking corpses in front of city gates and flaying rebel leaders alive. Not poetic exaggeration, actual policy. He had the records carved in cuneiform so future kings could learn from his work. "I cut off their heads," he wrote. "I built a tower of heads in front of their city." Decorative, right? The Assyrians invented terror tactics that would make even medieval inquisitors wince. They got creative with punishments, flaying, staking, and the occasional eye removal, just to keep things lively. If you surrendered early, you might just get enslaved. Resist? Your city burned, your leaders were tortured in public, and your children were marched away in chains. And they didn't keep it quiet. Assyrian kings filled their palaces with murals showing exactly what they did: flaying scenes, beheadings, mass deportations. It was ancient propaganda, carved in stone. A throne room in Nineveh featured a mural of a king sipping wine while his enemy's severed head hung in a tree behind him. That wasn't horror fiction. That was interior design. Their siege tactics were brutal and advanced. They built massive battering rams, dug tunnels under walls, and used archers to pick off defenders. Once the walls fell, the real nightmare began. Looting, assaults, and forced relocations were standard. Entire populations were uprooted and dumped into other corners of the empire. Over 4 million people were deported during the height of Assyrian rule. That's not conquest, that's ethnic cleansing. Even religion didn't offer mercy. The Assyrians believed their god Ashur wanted total dominance, so naturally, every war was holy. Kings described themselves as the weapon of Ashur. If you fought the empire, you weren't just defying a king, you were insulting a god. That made your punishment cosmic. Heads rolled fast. King Sennacherib took it to another level. In 701 BCE, when the city of Babylon rebelled, he didn't just crush it, he flattened it. Destroyed temples, demolished walls, diverted the Euphrates River to flood the ruins, and total annihilation. His own son later killed him, possibly because even other Assyrians thought he went too far. That's saying something. But the most feared king? Ashurbanipal. He ruled from 669 to 627 BCE and had a twisted flair for the dramatic. His greatest hits include parading a defeated Elamite king in chains through Nineveh, forcing him to wear dog collars, and making him live in a kennel. He wrote letters bragging about feeding enemy corpses to jackals. And when he captured rebel leaders, he liked to display their heads on pikes at city gates. Standard Assyrian welcome sign. Ashurbanipal was also shockingly literate. He built a massive library with over 3,000,000 clay tablets, medical texts, omens, epics, and more. So yes, he flayed people alive and also preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, because nothing says complex legacy like mass torture and literature. By the late 7th century BCE, the empire finally cracked. Years of rebellion, overextension, and sheer exhaustion wore them down. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians sacked Nineveh. The once invincible empire collapsed almost overnight. The libraries burned, the murals crumbled. The terror machine shut down, for good. Archaeologists digging up Assyrian sites in modern Iraq have found evidence of collapsed walls, crushed bones, and ash layers thick enough to prove one thing: the fall was fast, violent, and nobody bothered to save them. The Carthaginians. Ancient parenting. With flames. Most people know Carthage as the city Rome eventually burned to the ground. But before that, it was one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities in the ancient world. Massive navy, brilliant merchants, and a real knack for building trade routes across the Mediterranean. But behind all the gold and purple robes was something darker, something that made even the Romans flinch. The Carthaginians burned children alive. A lot of them. Let's rewind. Carthage was founded around 814 BCE by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, modern-day Lebanon. It grew fast. By the 4th century BCE, it was a superpower. They controlled North Africa, parts of Spain, and several islands. They weren't just traders. They were strategic, rich, and ruthless. They also had gods to feed. The two big ones were Baal Hammon and Tanit. Powerful, fiery deities. And when Carthaginians wanted something, a good harvest, a military victory, maybe just better weather, they gave them gifts. And the best gift? A firstborn child. This wasn't underground. This wasn't rare. It was state-sponsored ritual sacrifice. When archaeologists dug up the Tophet of Carthage, a sacred burial ground, they found thousands of urns. Inside were the cremated remains of infants, toddlers, and sometimes small animals. The oldest layers date back to the 8th century BCE. The practice continued for at least 600 years. Greek and Roman writers didn't hold back. Plutarch, Diodorus, and Tertullian all described the same thing: children placed on the outstretched arms of a bronze statue of Baal. A fire blazed beneath. The metal heated up. The child rolled into the flames. Drums and flutes blared to drown out the screams. And the crowd applauded. Now, modern historians have debated this. Some claim the children died naturally and were buried ceremonially. But the science doesn't back that up. Burn patterns on bones show signs of live cremation. Chemical tests confirm the infants were often only a few months old. And the inscriptions? They're chilling. Many urns have dedications like, "To our Lord Baal, in thanks." It was gratitude, not grief. And this wasn't just poor families. Rich elites were the most likely to offer their children because it showed deeper devotion. Some inscriptions even call out the family names, proudly declaring who sacrificed who. It was a religious status symbol, like donating a wing to a church, except your donation screamed. If things got really bad, famine, military losses, plagues, the sacrifices increased. Greek historian Cleitarchos claimed that during one crisis, 200 noble children were sacrificed in a single day, and when families ran out of kids, they adopted orphans or bought poor children to burn in their place. Because if your gods want blood, logistics must be handled. One Carthaginian legend even tells of King Hamilcar sacrificing his own son during a military defeat, tossed him into the flames without hesitation. And no, not the famous General Hannibal, that was his other son. Lucky break for the guy who went on to lead war elephants over the Alps. The Carthaginians didn't see it as murder. They believed it was a divine trade, life for favor. It wasn't cruel, it was necessary, a parent's ultimate act of loyalty. But the Romans? They were horrified. And this is a civilization that made people fight to the death for sport. When Rome finally defeated Carthage in 146 BCE, they destroyed the city, scattered the population, and poured salt into the earth. Some say it was symbolic. Others think it was just old-fashioned rage. But here's the kicker. Even after the fall, the child sacrifices didn't stop immediately. The Tophet site shows burials continuing into the Roman period. Old beliefs die hard, especially when fear is baked into the religion. Carthage was brilliant, powerful, and well-organized. But for all their greatness, their most famous legacy is a graveyard full of infant bones. They didn't hide their horror, they built temples on it. What do a judge's chair made of human skin, a milk and honey death sentence, and screaming kilns all have in common? They were all perfectly normal in ancient empires. And you've probably never heard of half of them. The Khmer Empire, temples, torture, and blood rites. Let's get this out of the way. Angkor Wat is not just a pretty postcard. The Khmer Empire didn't build all those temples with good vibes and incense. What powered it? Fear, forced labor, and the belief that the gods wanted blood, lots of it. Founded in 802 CE by Jayavarman II, the Khmer Empire ran on a mix of Hinduism, later Buddhism, and straight-up divine monarchy. The king wasn't just a ruler, he was the god. Literally. He claimed to be a living deity, a Devaraja. So disobeying him? That wasn't politics, that was cosmic blasphemy. And Khmer kings weren't soft about their divinity. When Jayavarman VIII came to power in the 13th century, he launched a violent crackdown against Buddhism. Why? Because he thought Hinduism was more god-tier. Statues of Buddha were smashed by the thousands. Monks were rounded up, tortured, and killed. Some had their tongues ripped out so they'd stop spreading lies. Others were blinded or executed in public. Jayavarman called it purification. Everyone else called it a nightmare. This empire was obsessed with cosmic balance, but their version of balance involved sacrificing humans to make sure the weather stayed good and the rice harvest didn't fail. Offerings were made to Shiva, Vishnu, Indra, you name it. Sometimes it was chickens or cows, but when the stakes were high, people disappeared. And not quietly. Stone carvings show execution scenes, victims kneeling with heads bowed, swords raised behind them. No one carved that for fun. Some inscriptions even mention prisoners being killed as gifts to the gods during temple dedications. New temple? Time to bleed. The logic? A sacred place needed sacred blood. If you were a commoner who broke the law, you didn't go to court. You went straight to pain. Punishments included being buried alive, flayed, or drowned in sacred ponds. Accused thieves had molten resin poured on their hands. If you screamed, you were guilty. If you didn't, you probably passed out first. Either way, that was the trial. Temples weren't just for worship. They were royal propaganda machines. Reliefs at Bayon and Bafwan show military victories, tribute parades, and ritual killings in loving detail. There's even a panel showing prisoners being impaled, straight through the gut, while officials look on, sipping something. That's how the Khmer advertised strength. And the workforce? Slavery by another name. Angkor's temples weren't built by volunteers. The empire ran on corvée labor. Forced laborers pulled from villages, conscripted by the tens of thousands. Farmers, fishermen, even children were ordered to build roads, canals, and temples. Some worked for years with no pay. Many died of disease or exhaustion. If you didn't show up for duty, soldiers dragged you out of your home. Or worse, they took your kids instead. Speaking of temples, Angkor Wat itself was built in the 12th century by Suryavarman II. It's the largest religious structure on Earth, and yes, it's stunning. But it was also a monument to control. Its massive moat wasn't just decorative, it was a cosmic symbol, but it also made escape harder for the thousands forced to build it. And when workers collapsed from heat stroke, they were often tossed into the same moat to rot. The Khmer elite believed everything in life needed order: the sky, the earth, and especially the people. The king sat at the top. Everyone else existed to feed, fight, or pray for him. There were righteous killings written into temple inscriptions. High priests oversaw ceremonies involving decapitations to remove impure energy from the empire. Jayavarman VII tried something different in the late 1100s. He was a Buddhist king, built hospitals, rest houses, and giant roads that stitched the empire together. But when the Chams invaded and sacked Angkor, the kindness stopped. He hit back hard. Some records talk about waves of executions, entire towns emptied, and temples built on enemy graves. Rumors say prisoners were buried alive under temples. Cursed objects sealed with them to trap their spirits forever. Nothing written, of course. Just the kind of stories people mutter when the statues start looking back. By the 14th century, the empire began to collapse. Overexpansion, water system failures, and wars with neighboring Thai kingdoms wore them down. But the real death blow came in 1431 when the Ayutthaya kingdom sacked Angkor. The capital was abandoned, temples fell into jungle, statues broke, rituals ended. The kings stopped being gods. But the stone carvings stayed, and they don't lie. The Khmer didn't just build temples, they built a theocracy that bled people dry, literally. And they called it sacred. The Etruscans, death parties, and blood-slick games. Long before the Romans were building aqueducts and stabbing emperors, the Etruscans ruled central Italy, and they were not the warm-up act. These people had cities, trade routes, advanced metalwork, and a terrifying obsession with death. Not just dying, ritual death, theatrical death, highly organized, fully sanctioned death. Let's start with the funerals. When an Etruscan noble dropped dead, They didn't get a quiet service and a few flowers. They got a bloodbath, literally. The send-off included gladiator-style fights, except this was before Rome made it cool. These were real fights, not for sport, but for the soul of the deceased. The idea was that spilled blood honored the dead and fed the afterlife. If you were a slave or prisoner, congratulations, you were the main event. Fighters weren't just handed swords and told, good luck. They were sometimes forced into combat using dull weapons or one hand tied, just to prolong the violence. Sometimes, victims were tied to stakes and stabbed repeatedly while guests cheered. This was entertainment and spiritual insurance. They believed the soul needed energy to make it through the underworld, and the energy came from death. The messier, the better. And then there were the dromoi, long, narrow corridors leading into underground tombs. These weren't just walkways. They were stages for ritual processions, sometimes ending with sacrifices right at the door. You couldn't enter the next life without a proper escort. And sometimes, that escort was a corpse. The Etruscans were also into divination by entrails. Yes, they would kill animals and, allegedly, the occasional human, rip out the organs, and have a priest called a haruspex read them like a fortune cookie. The liver was the preferred canvas. If it looked healthy, good omen. If it was blotchy or dark, time to panic and maybe kill someone to fix it. Religious texts called the Libri Haruspicini detailed what each organ pattern meant. These weren't vague guesses, they had charts. A misread liver could doom a city. No pressure, right? Their tombs were less like graves and more like private theaters for the dead. They filled them with art, furniture, weapons, food, and sometimes living people. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain tombs were sealed with attendants inside. Servants, slaves, maybe even family members, trapped and left to suffocate or starve alongside the body. Loyalty in the afterlife meant dying horribly in this one. And if you think that's grim, let's talk about their ancestor worship. In some regions, skulls of the deceased were exhumed, painted, and placed in family altars. You didn't remember Grandma. You stared at her eye sockets while eating dinner. The Romans, when they finally started pushing into Etruscan territory around the 4th century BCE, were horrified. Even they found some of this over the line. Roman writers like Livy and Pliny the Elder described Etruscan rituals as barbaric and blood-drenched. That's rich, coming from the people who invented public crucifixion. The thing is, Etruscans weren't unhinged. They had order, structure, and an entire spiritual system behind this madness. Sacrifice, pain, blood, it all meant something. It kept the gods happy, the ancestors respected, and the dead properly energized for the afterlife. There were rules to the chaos, but they couldn't fight time. By 264 BCE, Rome had absorbed the last of the Etruscan cities. Their rituals were outlawed. Their temples were demolished or converted. Their gods, forgotten. The blood stopped flowing, at least publicly. Still, their influence lingered. The Romans stole more than land. They borrowed gladiatorial combat, funeral rites, and even bits of religious ceremony, but they sanitized it, made it civilized. The Etruscans? They didn't sanitize anything. What's left now are the tombs, hundreds of them, scattered across Italy, still filled with painted walls, broken urns, and cryptic tools. And if you ever visit one, remember, this wasn't a culture obsessed with death. This was a culture that turned death into performance art. And the ticket price? Usually someone's throat. The Shang dynasty, Bronze Age blood economy. If you think ancient China was all peaceful rice paddies and paper lanterns, the Shang dynasty is here to ruin that image. These weren't gentle sages sipping tea. They were blood-soaked sorcerer kings with a god complex, a torture budget, and a taste for ritual death. The Shang ruled parts of northern China starting around 1600 BCE. They're credited with inventing writing, bronze casting, and the first Chinese cities. Sounds civilized, right? Until you realize their entire political and religious system ran on human sacrifice, and not just the occasional unlucky prisoner. This was industrial-scale killing, with official logs to back it up. Let's talk numbers. At the capital of Anyang, archaeologists found over 13 royal tombs with more than 3,000 human sacrifices buried around them. That's not a typo. Some tombs had over 200 bodies crammed into a single pit. Most were young adults or teenagers. Some still wore shackles. Others were decapitated, dismembered, or arranged like they were praying. Spoiler, they weren't. These sacrifices weren't chaotic. They were scripted. Shang rulers believed in communicating with dead ancestors through oracle bones, turtle shells, or ox scapulae carved with questions like, will it rain tomorrow? Will my wife give birth to a son? Or, should I murder 40 people this week to appease the river god? They'd heat the bones with metal rods until they cracked. The cracks were interpreted by diviners, who'd then tell the king what the spirits wanted. If the answer was kill, someone died. If it was kill more, dozens died. These weren't war criminals, they were servants, farmers, prisoners of war, people who existed as fuel for the spiritual machine. One oracle bone literally reads, "On the next ding day we shall sacrifice 10 men to the river god." And they didn't just kill you, they used you. Sometimes you were buried alive with a noble. Other times, your body was used to make ritual objects. Skulls were carved into bowls. Bones were polished and turned into instruments. Human remains became religious tools. The biggest royal tomb discovered belonged to Fu Hao, a powerful military general and queen. Her grave contained 16 human sacrifices, weapons, and over 700 jade and bronze artifacts. She was one of the few women in Shang records allowed to lead troops and conduct rituals. Her funerary pit still smelled like cooked meat when archaeologists first opened it. That's how well the dead were preserved. The Shang believed blood had power. Killing wasn't just punishment, it was purification. When there was a drought, they killed. When there was a flood, they killed. If a royal had a headache for 3 days, yep, kill. One bone record even says a sacrifice was needed because the king had a strange dream. Your nightmare meant someone else's throat. It wasn't all just priests and kings doing the damage. Executioners were a formal role in Shang society. Some burial sites show teams of killers working together. One to hold, one to bind, one to strike. Some victims had ropes still tied around their limbs. Others were found with ritual knives plunged into their ribs. No anesthesia, no delay. All in the name of harmony. The Shang also dabbled in cannibalism, mostly ritual. Some scholars debate and believe parts of the sacrificed victims were consumed by priests to absorb divine energy. Bones show cut marks consistent with butchering, whether it was symbolic or dinner, still debated. But what's not up for debate is this. The Shang turned divination into a death sentence. You didn't need to be guilty, you just needed to be nearby. By around 1046 BCE, the Zhou dynasty showed up and decided maybe there was too much stabbing. They overthrew the Shang at the Battle of Muye, reportedly after their own troops defected in disgust. King Zhou of Shang, the last ruler, allegedly set himself on fire when he lost. Honestly, it tracked. The Zhou cleaned house. They banned human sacrifice for a while, destroyed many Shang temples, and rebranded themselves as Mandate of Heaven guys, the ones who kill only when it's polite. So next time someone says ancient China was peaceful and wise, just hand them a Shang dynasty kill list. And let them know, those kings weren't meditating. They were busy scheduling their next blood delivery. The Achaemenid Persians perfected public pain. The Persians loved order, beauty, and empire. But let's not pretend they were peaceful. The Achaemenid Empire, the first Persian empire, wasn't just big, it was brutal. If you crossed them, you didn't get a warning. You got a front row seat to the worst day of your life, and so did everyone else. Founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BCE, the empire quickly swallowed up most of the known world. Babylon, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Central Asia. Massive infrastructure, road systems, postal service, all impressive. But their justice system, built to entertain the gods and the audience? Let's start with scaphism, maybe the most disgusting execution method in history. Here's how it worked. The condemned was trapped between two canoes, with just the head, hands, and feet sticking out. Then they were force-fed milk and honey until they had explosive diarrhea. Then more honey was smeared on their exposed skin to attract insects. The whole setup was floated on a swamp, and nature took it from there. Insects burrowed into every possible opening. Infections set in. Organs failed. Victims lasted up to 2 weeks, alive, rotting, screaming. The Persians considered this an exquisite punishment for traitors. One poor guy named Mithridates, a Persian soldier, got the full scaphism treatment after insulting King Artaxerxes II. Greek historians recorded every putrid detail. It wasn't folklore, it was policy. But that wasn't their only trick. Crucifixion? They had that before Rome. Impalement? A classic? Flaying? Absolutely. When King Darius I discovered a corrupt judge named Sesamnus, he had the man flayed alive, then ordered his skin nailed to the judge's chair. His replacement? Sesamnus' son. Talk about a motivational seating arrangement. They also loved mass execution for morale. After quelling a rebellion in Babylon, Xerxes reportedly beheaded thousands and impaled the city's leaders. His message was simple: disobedience equals display. In another revolt in Egypt, Persian commanders mutilated temple priests, burned sacred scrolls, and publicly desecrated the gods. Not because they hated the culture, but because fear kept the empire glued together. Then there's the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. Everyone remembers the 300 Spartans. What they forget? After defeating the Greeks, Xerxes ordered Leonidas' head chopped off and his body crucified. Why? Because you don't kill a king and get buried politely. Persian kings were obsessed with divine legitimacy. They claimed their right to rule came from Ahura Mazda, the main Zoroastrian god. So if you opposed the king, you weren't just rebelling, you were blaspheming. That made the punishment holy. And if your execution doubled as public theater, even better. Art and architecture also played a role in control. The palace at Persepolis, built under Darius and Xerxes, had walls filled with carved reliefs. Some show tribute bearers with gifts. Others, soldiers holding prisoners by the hair, knives pressed to their throats. It was elegant horror, propaganda carved in stone. Persian engineers even designed execution hills, elevated platforms where people could be flayed, hanged, or impaled in full view. Travelers on the Royal Road, 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis, passed by corpses dangling from posts like billboards. The message: behave or be part of the scenery. And don't assume this cruelty was reserved for outsiders. Internal purges happened often. Royal family drama was deadly. Xerxes had his own brother, Mesistes, ripped apart after a court scandal involving a princess in a robe. The royal court wasn't a soap opera. It was a bloodbath with gold trim. One governor, Bagaeus, eliminated a rival satrap by faking royal letters ordering executions. Then he killed anyone who questioned it. Clever? Yes. Approved by the king? Absolutely. In Persia, political strategy and brutal force weren't opposites. They were partners. Then Alexander the Great arrived. In 330 BCE, he burned Persepolis after a drunken banquet. Some say it was revenge for Persian attacks on Greece. Others say it was just ego. Either way, the empire collapsed in flames and wine. What's left of the Achaemenid dynasty are ruins, inscriptions, and execution manuals disguised as royal decrees. Behind the beautiful columns and orderly systems was a government that turned pain into policy and made sure you died slow enough for everyone to get the message. The Nok civilization, ritual burning and sacred entrapment. The Nok are famous for their terracotta sculptures, those eerie, wide-eyed faces with intricate hair and hollow expressions. But behind the art lies something a lot darker. These weren't just early African artists. They were part of a civilization that may have used fire and flesh to talk to the gods. The Nok flourished in what's now central Nigeria from around 1000 BCE to 300 CE. They left no scrolls, no writing, just fragments of a mystery. Terracotta heads buried deep beside scorched bones, iron tools, and kilns that some say held more than clay. Archaeologists debate the meaning, but the layers don't lie. Something strange burned through that soil. Let's start with the basics. Nok society had complex settlements, iron smelting, and a sharp artistic eye. But archaeology tells a much grimmer story. In the 1940s, workers digging for tin stumbled across terracotta heads buried near piles of ash, scorched bone, and human teeth. No one's calling it ritual yet. But the kilns were hot enough to melt terracotta, and whatever else was inside. That wasn't a one-off. Multiple excavation sites have revealed bodies buried inside or right next to firing chambers, places clearly designed for high-heat ceramic work. Bones showed signs of extreme burning, not consistent with simple cremation. Some were warped, melted. Others were fused to the inside of the kiln. That's not ceremonial disposal. That's something else. Many of the skeletons showed signs of trauma, bindings, fractures, and blunt force damage that didn't happen by accident. The burn patterns? Uneven, rushed, and close range. Maybe it happened after death. Maybe not. No one's saying it out loud, but the setup feels deliberate. The leading theory? Spiritual entrapment. Nok religious beliefs, reconstructed from burial patterns and later oral traditions, may have centered around capturing human energy. Some bodies were buried beneath thresholds or entrances, a classic spiritual anchor placement in ancient African cultures. The theory is that killing someone and encasing them in clay helped trap their essence for good luck, protection, or fertility. Then there's the issue of the terracotta figures. Hundreds have been found heads, torsos, limbs all carefully shaped and fired. But some had cutouts in the back, big enough to insert something. What? Probably offerings. Possibly ash. And maybe, just maybe, pieces of people. Nearby burial pits add more to the horror. Clusters of bodies. Many show signs of charring, with fractures that suggest this wasn't peaceful. In a few spots, children's remains turned up beside broken pottery and animal bones. Some say offerings, others aren't sure. But nothing about the arrangement looks random. One dig site in Kaduna turned up something strange. Scorched child remains buried near a massive terracotta head. The bones were clustered close, surrounded by ash, but no coffins, no wrappings, nothing ceremonial, just raw clay, heat, and bone. Some archaeologists think it was more than grave decor. Maybe it wasn't honoring the dead. Maybe it was the reason they were there. And this wasn't just poor families or outcasts. Some of the bodies had bronze jewelry, iron tools, and high-value goods. These weren't executions, they were sacrifices. High-end ones. Nok culture also had something resembling caste or status roles, inferred from house size and grave goods. The theory? The higher your status, the more likely you were to be involved in these rituals, either as the one giving the offering or the one becoming it. An honor if you were into that sort of thing. A death sentence if you weren't. Eventually, around 300 CE, Nok civilization faded. Nobody knows exactly why. Drought? Conflict? Internal collapse? Whatever happened, their kilns went cold. Their statues stopped multiplying, and the fires that once melted bone and clay into sacred offerings flickered out. The Nok didn't leave a warning. They left puzzles. Their legacy isn't just artistic, it's terrifying. For a civilization with no written word, they said one thing loud and clear. If the gods want fire, feed them something that screams. From Viking lung displays to Carthaginian child fires, ancient civilizations didn't just punish. They made sure you were never remembered the same way again. These aren't just deaths. They're historical nightmares, and every single one of them actually happened. The Sumerian nail impalement. So, you steal temple grain, fudge a tax record, or insult the king. In modern times, you'd get a fine or maybe a prison cell. But in Sumer, you got nailed. Literally. On a stick. In public. Welcome to Lagash, around 2400 BCE. One of the earliest documented cities with a fully functioning legal system and zero chill. Their version of crime control was short, sharp, and horrifying. The punishment? Impalement. No metaphors here. The body was hoisted onto a wooden stake, probably through the abdomen or chest, and displayed for all to see. This wasn't symbolic, it was the message. The earliest known visual of this method comes from the Stele of the Vultures, a carved limestone slab from Gursu. It shows bodies hanging like gruesome banners, lined up neatly on spikes after a war between Lagash and their farming rivals from Umma. King Eannatum led that campaign, and historians believe he used impalement not just for soldiers, but for rebels, looters, and anyone dumb enough to challenge temple property laws. And they had laws. Cuneiform records written in wedge-shaped symbols talk about penalties for everything, from tax dodging to sacrilege. Several tablets from the city of mention nailing as the outcome for crimes like defiling a shrine or rebelling against the king's word. That meant death by impalement, then public display at the city gate. You became scenery. Unlike later empires, the Sumerians didn't add flair. No ritual chants, no drawn-out speeches. They skewered you, stood you upright, and let the flies do the rest. Experts say the average person might have survived for hours, possibly longer, depending on how the stake was placed. Archaeologists found human remains near city walls that showed deliberate positioning, not a burial. These weren't accidents, they were warnings. Sumer invented the wheel and writing, but they also invented a brutal version of "don't mess with us." And thanks to stone tablets and artistic receipts, we know exactly what happened when you crossed the line. Retainer sacrifice in early dynastic Egypt. In today's job market, people quit for bad hours or a toxic boss. In early dynastic Egypt, you died when your boss did, on purpose. With ceremony. Around 2900 BCE, under Pharaoh Jer, possibly Egypt's third king of the first dynasty, the concept of loyalty took a deadly turn. Archaeologists excavating at Abydos found something that made jaws drop and spines freeze. Over 300 human graves neatly arranged around the king's burial chamber. These weren't mass burials. Each person had their own tomb, grave goods, and in some cases, jewelry. Translation? These people weren't slaves, they were high-status retainers, and they were sacrificed. Jer's tomb alone had at least 318 auxiliary burials, according to W.B. Emery's detailed archaeological reports. Some victims appear to have been strangled, possibly with linen cords, and carefully buried shortly after death. No broken bones, no signs of a struggle. Just bodies placed with precision, as if they'd volunteered to clock out of life permanent. But they didn't volunteer. These were likely court servants, nurses, cooks, guards, and even musicians. When the pharaoh died, they were killed so they could serve him in the afterlife. Think of it as an ancient office culture where quitting wasn't an option, and HR wore linen shrouds. And it wasn't just Jer. His predecessors, like King Aha, also had dozens of retainers buried alongside them. Tomb Uj, possibly belonging to the mysterious proto-king Scorpion I, revealed bodies with evidence of decapitation, not for rebellion, just for proximity to power. For 3 generations, this deadly tradition continued. Pharaoh dies, his staff dies with him, but eventually, even Egypt realized this was getting out of hand. By the end of the Second Dynasty, Pharaoh Khsekhemwy's tomb included Shabti figurines, small statues meant to work for him in the afterlife. Plastic employees, Ancient edition. Much cheaper. Much less bloody. So next time your boss sends a passive-aggressive email, remember, at least you're not being strangled and buried in his tomb. Progress. The Hittite burning ritual. The Hittites ran their empire like a strict school with a flamethrower. They had rules, hundreds of them, etched into clay tablets. And if you broke one in a way that offended the gods, fire. Somewhere around 1400 BCE, the Hittites were ruling much of Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey. Their legal codes, especially tablets from the capital Hattusa, didn't hold back. Among the most terrifying lines in the Code of the Hittites, burning as a punishment for certain religious crimes. And we're not talking symbolic burning here. We're talking actual live immolation, sometimes done in public, always with purpose. The Hittites were obsessed with purity, ritual, spiritual, and political. If someone insulted a temple, defiled sacred space, or violated oaths to the gods, they weren't just killed. They were given to the fire. One tablet outlines the punishment for desecrating temple food. The offender shall not live and be burned in a ritual cleansing. This wasn't daily justice. Regular criminals got fines, lashes, or exile. But blasphemers? They got flames. There are records of priests and scribes performing fire ceremonies where condemned individuals were burned to appease angry gods, especially the storm god Tarhunt. And this wasn't clean or quick. It wasn't supposed to be. The burning was both punishment and purification, a violent reset button. Victims were sometimes burned at the edge of temples, where offerings were made. Their deaths were meant to carry the spiritual weight of cleansing the community. It's worth noting, the Hittites didn't use this on political rebels or common thieves. This was sacred punishment, aimed squarely at those seen as spiritual threats. Think heretics, oath-breakers, and people who insulted divine order. Archaeologists have found charred human remains in and near ceremonial fire pits in sites like Yazilikaya and Alaka-Huyuk. While we can't assign each bone to a crime, the placement and context match with ritual descriptions in the tablets. So, yes, the Hittites were legal pioneers. But if you ever find yourself time-traveling to Bronze Age Anatolia, here's a tip. Don't mess with the temple bread, or the gods might bake you. Tower crucifixion in Achaemenid Persia. Persia had palaces, postal systems, and some of the worst ways to die if you annoyed the king. Top of the list? Crucifixion. But this wasn't Rome yet. The Persians did it higher, slower, and with extra humiliation. Let's rewind to 522 BCE, when Darius I had just taken the throne. It wasn't peaceful. A rebel named Nidintubel popped up in Babylon claiming to be the long-lost King Nebuchadnezzar III. That went over poorly. Darius crushed the rebellion and made sure nobody forgot it. According to the Behistun inscription, a trilingual rock-carved record Darius left like a Bronze Age press release, the fake king was captured and publicly crucified. Now, Persian crucifixion wasn't the same as the Roman version. They didn't nail people to T-shaped crosses. They used wooden beams or tall stakes, often placing them high above city gates or on towers. Why? So the corpse could hang there for days, rotting in the sun, visible to everyone, a warning from 40 feet up. Greek historians backed it up. Herodotus, not exactly subtle, said Darius had tens of thousands of men crucified in Babylon after one revolt. That's not poetic language, that's logistics. Thousands of vertical poles lined up outside the city, each with a body swinging from it like some horrific fence. And it wasn't just for rebels. Persian law under Darius allowed crucifixion for soldiers who deserted, nobles who plotted coups, and even corrupt officials. According to Ctesias, another Greek source, one corrupt judge was flayed alive and then nailed to a post made of his own skin, creative HR. This method didn't end with Darius. His successors, including Xerxes, used it during military campaigns. After the failed invasion of Greece, Xerxes reportedly crucified his own engineers for screwing up a bridge over the Hellespont. Harsh Yelp review. Now, if you were climbing the political ladder in Achaemenid Persia, here's the rule. Don't fake your resume. Darius didn't just end your rebellion. He hung you on a pole and carved your failure into stone. Literally. Scaphism, the Persian death that took days. If crucifixion was the Persian billboard for traitors, Scaphism was the underground horror show. No spikes and swords, only milk, honey, and bugs. And it may be the slowest, grossest execution ever recorded. The story comes from Plutarch, who, in Life of Artaxerxes, gives a detailed and very real account of what happened to a Persian soldier named Mithridates around 401 BCE. His crime? He accidentally bragged that he, not the king's brother Cyrus, killed a rival in battle. Big mistake. The king, Artaxerxes II, decided to make him an example. A long, slow, squirming one. Here's how it worked. The The condemned was placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats or logs, exposing only the head, hands, and feet. Then, he was force-fed milk and honey until he developed massive, uncontrollable diarrhea. The executioners then smeared more milk and honey over his exposed skin and left him floating in a stagnant swamp. The result? Insects. Thousands of them. They didn't just bite. They nested. They burrowed. They laid eggs in his skin, mouth, and eyes. Every day, the victim was cleaned up just enough to keep him alive, then fed again, and again, and again. According to Plutarch, Mithridates lasted 17 days before finally dying. 17 days. That's over 2 weeks of rot, infection, madness, and slow digestion by insects. It wasn't just physical torture. It was psychological annihilation. Historians have debated whether this punishment was common. There's no evidence it was widespread. It wasn't used on peasants or petty thieves. This was a royal punishment, reserved for people who insulted the king or committed grave political blunders. A method so vile, it didn't need to be used often, but just whispered about. And while Plutarch was Greek, other sources confirm similar punishment styles involving entrapment, exposure, and forced feeding as a form of ritual disgrace. Escapism wasn't about killing someone fast. It was about turning a man into a feast for the natural world and letting everyone know. Persia knew how to build roads, irrigate deserts, and manage empires. But they also invented a death so slow. Even crucifixion looked like mercy. Carthaginian child sacrifice. You've heard of ancient gods demanding loyalty. In Carthage, they demanded something else. Your child. And yes, this really happened. Around 300 BCE, the city of Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, was thriving. Powerful navy, booming trade, fancy purple dyes. But behind the marble temples sat a place called the Tophet. It looked like a peaceful cemetery. It wasn't. It was a ritual sacrifice zone, and most of the bodies buried there were children. Ancient writers didn't pull punches. Diodorus Siculus wrote that when Carthage faced disaster, plague, famine, military loss, they believed their god Baal-Hamon was angry. And the only way to fix it? Burn children alive, not figuratively, actually, in a bronze furnace shaped like a god with outstretched arms. You'd place the child in the statue's hands. The priest pulled a lever. The child rolled into a pit of fire. Some kids were volunteered by wealthy families trying to impress the gods. Others, historians think, were poor or enslaved. Carthaginian elites even claimed they were sacrificing surrogates, children raised for this. Nice try, the bones don't lie. In the 20th century, skeptics said Roman authors made this up to smear Carthage. Then, archaeologists started digging. What they found? Thousands of urns in the Tophets of Carthage, Motia, and other Punic sites are packed with charred infant bones and animal remains. Some were newborns, others were toddlers. Studies by archaeologist Lawrence Steger and others proved that the high number of cremated infants couldn't be explained by natural death. The bones were burned at high heat, consistent with large-scale, open-air fire pits or furnaces. And get this, many urns had inscriptions like, "Offering to Baal." No ambiguity. This was child sacrifice. There's even a chilling ritual term, mulk, used in Phoenician texts to describe the offering. It literally means a gift. Eventually, Roman forces obliterated Carthage in 146 BCE, leveling the city. But by then, thousands of children had already been given to the fire in the name of cosmic balance. The Roman poena culae, death by sack. The Romans were obsessed with order. Kill your neighbor? You might get a sword. Kill your father? You got the sack, literally. The punishment was called poena culae, Latin for penalty of the sack, and it was the Roman Republic's way of saying parricide is the worst thing you can do. Forget crucifixion, forget exile. If you killed your dad, or mom, or grandparent, Rome turned your execution into a bizarre animal-filled nightmare. Here's how it worked. First, you were beaten with rods. Then, you were sewn into a leather sack with 4 animals, a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. The symbolism? No one's exactly sure. The dog represented madness, the monkey chaos, the snake betrayal, and the rooster, you guessed it, constant screaming. Basically, you were locked in a screaming, biting, writhing sack of poetic justice. Once sewn in, the sack, called a culeus, was tossed into the Tiber River, or the sea if they felt dramatic. You drowned, but not before the monkey clawed your face and the snake did its thing. In Roman terms, that was total erasure. This wasn't a myth. It's recorded in the Digest of Justinian, a massive Roman law code, and referenced by Cicero, who defended a man accused of parricide. It was used in real Roman courts and carried out for centuries. Even Emperor Hadrian revived it in the 2nd century CE for dramatic effect. Sometimes, if animals weren't available, they improvised. There are records of criminals sewn up solo or with fewer animals. But the symbolism stuck. Parricide didn't just break the law, it shattered the natural order. And Rome made sure you paid for it with every squawk and hiss. It was so specific, so theatrical, and so uniquely Roman that even other brutal civilizations didn't copy it. Leave it to Rome to turn a murder trial into a zoo-themed drowning show. Slow slicing in Han Dynasty China. In ancient China, they didn't just punish you, they processed you. And if your crime was big enough, like treason, desertion, or insulting the emperor, they had a punishment to match. Slow slicing, the prototype of what later became known as lingqi. We're in the Western Han Dynasty, around 100 BCE, when Emperor Wu was cracking down on threats, real or imagined. While the fully ritualized lingqi wouldn't be formalized until the Song Dynasty, early Han texts already describe executions involving gradual dismemberment, piece by piece, while the victim was still alive. The official term? Lingqi, or cut punishment. It was written into legal codes for crimes that offended both the state and heaven. Unlike your standard beheading or hanging, this was reserved for traitors and especially hated criminals. Why? Because in Chinese belief, a whole body was needed for a proper afterlife. The method? First, the prisoner was tied upright. Then, the executioner would slice off the flesh in sections, starting with the arms, the chest, and sometimes even the face. Internal organs were left for last. It wasn't quick. That was the point. You died in stages, fully aware, as each cut robbed you of dignity, life, and afterlife. A few ancient commentaries mention criminals being cut into 8 pieces. Not metaphor, that was the plan. And your family? Also punished. Your sons could be enslaved, your name banned from being written down. You didn't just lose your life, you lost legacy. Records from this time also describe exemplary punishments, where the condemned were displayed publicly during slicing. Townsfolk were encouraged to watch, children included. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, lingqi got more elaborate, sometimes involving hundreds of cuts. But the Han set the tone. Execution is erasure, not just of a body, but of a soul. So no, the Han dynasty wasn't just about calligraphy and Confucianism. It also pioneered one of history's most methodical forms of public dismemberment. And if your final moments involved a crowd counting your body parts, you were probably already dead, in every way that mattered. Maya heart extraction ritual. The Maya gave us calendars, pyramids, and math. They also gave us one of the most efficient ways to lose your heart, literally. Because if you were a prisoner of war, or a human offering during certain festivals, you weren't walking away, you were getting carved open on an altar, while still breathing. By 900 CE, in cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, the Maya were performing ritual heart extractions at major temples. This wasn't some back-alley sacrifice. It was state-sponsored religion, often tied to agricultural cycles, calendar rituals, or honoring gods like Kawil and Chak. Here's how it worked. The victim, usually a captured warrior, slave, or even a high-status noble, was painted blue, a color symbolizing death and sacrifice. He was brought to the top of a pyramid, often the temple of Kukulkan, where a priest would lay him flat on a stone altar, sometimes bending his chest over a curved slab for easier access. Then came the blade. Obsidian or flint, razor-sharp but brittle. The priest would make a vertical cut through the chest, reach in and remove the still-beating heart. Yes, this is real. Spanish conquistadors like Diego de Landa and later chroniclers wrote about it in grim detail, and Maya carvings and murals back it up, showing the scene repeatedly, like a spiritual instruction manual. The heart was then offered to the gods, either burned as incense or placed on a sacred plate. In some cases, the body was tossed down the temple stairs, a final flourish to the ceremony. Fun fact? Some bodies were later flayed or decapitated as part of additional rituals, especially during ball games, where winners, or losers, were sometimes sacrificed too. Archaeologists have found human remains at Maya temples showing chest incisions, cut ribs, and missing sternums, physical proof that this wasn't just legend. It was practiced for centuries, deeply tied to Maya beliefs about feeding the gods and maintaining cosmic balance. To the Maya, sacrifice wasn't cruelty. It was currency, a way to keep the sun rising and the crops growing. But for the guy on the altar, let's be honest, he didn't care about balance. He just lost the worst lottery in history, and his heart paid the price. The Viking blood eagle. You've heard of Viking raids, but have you heard of the execution that made even warriors flinch? It was called the blood eagle, and if the sagas are even halfway true, it wasn't just a death. It was a performance. The blood eagle shows up in Icelandic texts like the Tale of Ragnar's Sons and the Orkney-Inga saga, written a couple centuries after the events they describe. The setup? A high-status enemy commits treason, kills a family member, or breaks an oath. The punishment? You get turned into an offering with your back wide open. Here's how it allegedly went. The victim was tied face down. Then, the executioner used a sharp blade, probably a CX or long knife, to slice open the rib cage from the spine, separating the ribs like wings. Each rib was pulled outward. The lungs were then dragged out through the opening and laid over the ribs, fluttering like wings. Hence, the eagle. Was it fast? Not even close. The point was to keep the person alive during the process, at least through the rib carving. The ultimate humiliation was making the lungs appear to flap, while the person still gasped for air. You weren't just being killed. You were being displayed like a grotesque banner of dishonor. One of the most famous alleged victims was King Ella of Northumbria, the guy who killed legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar's sons captured Ella and performed the blood eagle on him as revenge. Whether it really happened? Still debated. But the ritual pops up in multiple texts, usually as punishment for oath-breaking or regicide, the worst crimes in Viking law. Skeptics say it's a literary invention, more poetic than practical. But some historians argue it could be physically possible, if horrifying. At least partial versions of it. Either way, it was meant to terrify. There's no archaeological proof yet, no carved-back skeletons have been found, but the idea of a death so gruesome it survives centuries of storytelling? That says something. Whether fully real or slightly embellished, the blood eagle remains one of the darkest executions ever whispered through history. Not just because of what it did to the body, but because of what it did to the reputation of anyone who saw it. In Viking culture, honor was everything, but this was how you ended someone forever.